All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we're getting an early jump on this, my friends. We're talking about Preparedness Week that's coming up in May and why you, the population, summarily ignores everything the government has to say. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. Appreciate you dropping by, saying hi, and thanks for all of your ongoing messages at InsideMyCanoehead.ca, the website hosting and landing page for this podcast. We are downloaded in 68 nations across 6 continents and almost 30,000 total downloads. Well over 320 episodes. We've been on the air talking preparedness since April of 2020, right after this significant little thing happened in March of 2020. And we all realized collectively that the world was totally and absolutely and unquestionably unprepared for a significant major event to strike. And the pandemic simply proved that point. If you think of the number of people who required external influence or external help from outside their immediate family and community in order to make it through the pandemic, demonstrates the level of preparedness within the population. So every year, all governments within Western nations, normally in the month of May, either for the month or the week, have a preparedness messaging surge. The government issues a whole bunch of material, buys a whole bunch of advertising, all in a methodology to try to persuade you that their message is accurate, it's valuable, and it contains behaviors that you should adopt. My question now is, based upon all the evidence that we've seen in the recent pandemic, why aren't you listening? And whether we look at local or major international events, we can see it even past, we've seen the fires in California, we've seen the hurricane that hit Florida, North Carolina, and parts of the American Southeast. We've seen continued happenings from various different floods and hurricanes on the East Coast that are very predictable. I grew up in hurricane territory. You know the East Coast of North America is going to get smoked by a hurricane every year. It is not something new. It is not something innovative, and it is very much expected and predicted. In fact, hurricanes can be predicted many days out, often a week out, and as the cone of uncertainty, as they say, starts to shrink and we come more and more close to the landfall, there's so much plethora of information out there, yet we see in both the visual representations on TV and the actual commentary that's issued online and in social media that the population is not doing the things that the government recommends and it's not getting prepared. Now, there's a whole bunch to unpack there, and so we're going to try to compartmentalize this into a couple of discussions. Number one, why is the government giving the current message, be informed, have a plan, and build a kit? Now, that started in the 1950s and into the 1960s, based in what we refer to as the civil defense era. See, the original preparedness communications that came out in that era were about getting North Americans ready and Europeans for the likely impact of a nuclear weapon when all-out mutual assured destruction was launched by America or the Soviet Union against each other, and that your site would likely be either be directly affected or the environment in which you live, maybe in a rural area, would be eventually affected by the fallout and various different things. So the message at that time was, very simply, we're going to tell you when something's happening. We're going to tell you what to do when the emergency was coming based upon the amount of time. And then you're going to have to hunker in a bunker, as we used to say, and you're going to have to wait. And then the government will tell you what to do next, and the government will be there to rescue you. That was the message that was sent out during the Cold War. The reason the message was sent out in that methodology was people paid attention and a much higher degree of institutional trust at the time. because a nuclear warfare and a nuclear weapons were so overwhelming, the concept of a household preparedness plan for that was just not something that every rational person can think of. So the government was like, okay, this is totally overwhelming beyond anything else that you could imagine and permanently life-changing. You need to listen to us. They were seen as the only real authority that knew anything about this. And remember, at the time, social media didn't happen, and it was either a radio, a TV news broadcast, or a newspaper that brought people different pieces of opinion. So the options that were available were far less at the time. The idea behind the government is going to tell you what to do post-event was one of two outcomes. And when you look at a lot of the data that came out and a lot of the writings that came out of what we thought at the time in the Cold War, what an actual nuclear exchange would look like is 72 hours would tell us one of two things. One, that the effects were far less than we thought they would be, and that an emergence and a reorganization of a larger, greater than tribal society would be possible. And that the US government, the Canadian government, the UK government would be able to assert some level of control or in some level of competence governance over what was an unaffected territory and to begin to roll out provision of assistance to the population. That would be known within 72 hours because, as Annie's book says, it's about 27 minutes to start and finish an entire nuclear conflict. And so in 72 hours, we would know. Realistically, though, embedded in the longer planning data was the likely outcome was 72 hours later, there would be nothing left. Nothing of a significance from a government perspective, and there would be no more messaging. So after 72 hours, there would be the rinse and repeat radio rebroadcast from what was available, and that society would simply, at that time, be left to itself to resuscitate what it could, likely in small tribal sense, and start an attempt to reestablish a human society. Now, you got to understand, this looks incredibly different for the global north and the global south. The global north would be fighting that war. The global north would be exchanging nuclear weapons with each other. The global south would not, right? All of the majority, other than some in Southeast Asia, the majority of southern nations in the world were not involved in this nuclear exchange, would not likely be targeted in the nuclear exchange, and would likely be a significant period, like, a couple of days, a week or two, before they got to the position where they would start to see effects. So can you imagine living in New Zealand, a massive nuclear exchange, hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of people are dead, and your entire population is unaffected for the first little while, and then you have global, winter coming in, etc. But your population is not smacked with an actual nuclear weapon, right? So within that 72 hours, the government of New Zealand would be able to resurrect communications, start talking to their people, and start organizing how the New Zealand or the Australian or Tuvalu, whatever it may be, how these societies would attempt to protect and survive to the extent that they can as a result of conditions that were beyond their control. But that they did not actually take a direct nuclear hit that created that kind of calamity. So that's the idea behind that message of what I would call dependency. A dependency message in that you are required to listen to the government and you are required to listen to instructions. That message, to some degree, is now looked at when we hear the be informed, have a plan, make a kit thing, is the modern version of that. And the challenge is that we have is that message is based in belief and opinion and not evidence. Now, I'm going to position that comment behind the fact that I have spent personally over a decade researching this very specific niche called public sector resident-facing preparedness communications, okay? That is my research specialty. It's what I wrote my PhD on. It's actually what I wrote my master's thesis on as well. It is the one area of the preparedness field that I have zero focused all of my research energy on and continue to do so. If you follow me on LinkedIn, Jeff Donaldson, PhD, over on LinkedIn, we've published the 2025 research plan for my firm, Preparedness Labs Incorporated, and we're going to continue looking at a series of variables that we think are correlated with better post-event outcomes. And I'll get to them later in the podcast. But we're doing research in this area, but it's also the area that I've personally spent over a decade in. Right now, the problem is that we have no evidence that if the entire population of North America followed the advice as it's laid out in the current, whether there actually would be any increase in better post-event outcomes. And why I say post-event outcomes is it's a measurement of if you do an activity. If I tell you to do A, and I'm arguing with you that A means when a bad day happens, it will be a better day for you and your outcome will be better, which means it'll happen quicker. You'll have less impact, less damage, less interruption with your normal lifestyle. Basically, it will be a less severe experience for you and your family. That's a better post-event outcome. Our idea here, and what I would argue is a simplistic view at it, and trust me, I can go down the road of all your theoretical frames and 15 different research articles. Happy to do that. I prefer to talk in the simplistic sense of preparedness communications. Their intent is to advise based upon evidence, to advise the community on what actions they should undertake that is within their power that will lead to better post-event outcomes. That's the simplistic theory behind preparedness communications. If you were to do everything that the government said now, be informed, which means listen to them, have a plan, which means a household evacuation plan, how to get out in a fire, how to communicate with people, and then you build an emergency kit based upon the lists that are put out by the Red Cross, etc. If you were to do that, there's no evidence showing you would have a better post-event outcome. There's no event that saying that you would have a less disruptive experience because of that. When we look at evidence, what I mean by that is we've gone back, for example, just on the emergency kit alone, which is something I rail against periodically. And no, this is not against people who have bigger ideas and bigger plans in it. And I interviewed a fantastic individual from California that sells emergency kits. I'm talking about collecting batteries, flashlights, and non-perishable food and some water in your household. When you look at the evidence in Canada in the last 50 years, the number of people who have died or been significantly injured as a result of not having or having a response or hazard-induced need for potable water, food, flashlights, and batteries is nil, like zero. So if you're knowingly telling somebody to do something that the evidence clearly shows does not equate to a better post-event outcome, then my question to you is, why are you wasting the very little time you have? And we got to remember that even here on social media, I'm competing with 1.4 million people on Apple Podcast, and it's probably going to be 2 million by the end of the decade or more. Everybody starts a podcast, right? So I'm in competition with everybody else out there who has a voice in the space, right? You, as an individual who's consuming social media, who's consuming messaging, who's looking at the world around them, anybody who wants your attention is in competition. And we see the billions of dollars that corporations spent on advertising in the world in an attempt to get a click from you, to get a moment of attention, to try to pause your scrolling and to focus on what they're offering. There are billions of dollars every day spent in advertising on social media, yet the government believes that simply because the message is coming from them, it therefore has a higher priority, is more accurate, and therefore you should just by default stop scrolling and listening to the government. That is a positional authority attitude. That gets you nowhere. We know that clearly, that people don't listen simply because of a position you hold. What the government doesn't understand, and I try to persuade on a regular basis, is the government is in a marketing competition against everybody else for your time. So they've got to look at it from a marketing principles. What's the target audience? What's the medium? What's the target audience concerned about? What really concerns you? I've realized over time But the vast majority of people in North America and Europe don't get up every morning with this crazy, strange fear in their head that they're not prepared for the next disaster and they need to start their day about seeking preparedness information, right? Nobody thinks that way when they swing their legs out of the border. But what people do think about is risk to their families, to their kids, to their elderly parents, risk to losing their jobs. So the presence of risk and the fear of potential bad outcomes is present in people's lives. So if you address strategies that mitigate that, right? But if you take the strategy that the government is telling you now, the best simplification I have on it is it's designed to create professional victims, right? It's designed to create a group of people who need to sit back, hunker down, listen to the government, hang on to their every message, and wait to be rescued, right? That's a professional victim. That's what the government messaging is telling people to do. However, if you want to talk about evidence-based, and I go on for this, it's in our tagline for the podcast, it's in our tagline for our parent company, Preparedness Labs Incorporated. If you want evidence-based education on preparedness, then you have to listen to the evidence. And when we go in the body of academic knowledge, the gray literature, publications from not-for-profits, international multilateral organizations, and we look to examine populations that have undergone significant events, we look for the subset, the substrata of that population who did have better post-event outcomes than their peers, even though they experienced the same event. We look at that substrata of the population and we investigate. We want to know what they did different that the rest of the population didn't do, that we're able to identify, so that we can turn around and say, hey, listen, here's a bunch of populations that did these things and it led to better post-event outcomes. And when we see those variables, as we refer to them, replicated in many disasters, and so we keep looking back at disaster data sets for the last couple hundred years, and the groups from communities that have better post-event outcomes consistently show this variable to a higher level, we can sit back and say, well, isn't that something we should pay attention to? And so what we do here at Preparedness Labs Incorporated in our research division is we look at those very data sets, right? It's not what I believe. Nobody should care what Jeff believes. Nobody should care what Dr. D thinks is right? It's not about belief and opinion, it's about evidence. And the hard part for a lot of people out there is when the evidence contradicts what you believe to be true. People have a very significant, and across a whole bunch of issues, when you say to them, hey, you have this long-standing belief that A is true. However, here's a whole bunch of data that shows B is in fact true and A is not. Most people will argue. They will argue because they have something called sunk cost fallacy, which means they've invested time, energy, belief, social capital, political capital, everything into A being true. And once A is demonstrated to no longer be true, most people have a difficult time just walking away from all that time and effort. That's why if you bought a $150 item and you bring it home and a month later it's useless, you're not using it anymore. You don't throw it out because to you it's $150. You spent $150. You've invested in this thing. You can't just dump it at the curb and give it away. You've got to try to either sell it, extract some value, or figure out how to use it, because looking yourself in the mirror and saying that $150 is, this thing is no longer useful to me, off you go, bye-bye, is countercultural. The same thing is when you hold an idea to be true and the evidence challenges that. And so when I challenge the current body of knowledge and the current thinking on preparedness communications, again, I've been doing this sucker for a decade, right? So I'm quite confident in what I'm saying is accurate because I've got the data to back it up. I've got the evidence to back it up. And on top of that, I'm not the only voice in this field. This is not like crazy Dr. D says this and everybody else doesn't, right? When we look at those subject groups that did better post-event outcomes, there are 4 variables that we talk about, right? 4 things emerge that are not contained in the current preparedness communication that are tied to groups who have better post-event outcomes, right? Number 1 is your sense of place, your sense of belonging, and your tie to the community where you lie. We call it the theory of social capital. I've done a bunch of stuff about it before. I'm the secretary of the board of directors of the International Social Capital Association. I'm also the chair of the special interest group on disaster resilience within the Social Capital Association. So I spent a great deal of time researching this. Social capital is just collectively your sense of belonging, your ties to other people, the strengths and the resources that are embedded in your social networks. So communities with really strong social ties, sense of belonging, sense of place, they have better post-event outcomes. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. I'm not going to burn a whole podcast episode on that, but essentially it's because you have strong relationships with your neighbors, you help them out, you extract resources, whether they be financial, physical resources, etc. So basically, a strong community with strong social capital will feed, water, and house itself without needing the government, right? They basically take care of each other. Absolutely unquestioned. They don't need government intervention. They'll do that on their own. The second part of it is the level of preparedness. Now, this one is a little bit more complex because we have to first ask the question, how do you define a prepared individual? If I was to say to you, and I do this to my students in graduate program as well, if I was to put an avatar or put a person up at the front of the classroom and say, okay, there in front of you is a prepared person, how do you describe them? So would you describe them as having a certain set of skills, a certain set of knowledge, a certain set of possessions, or a combination thereof, right? So in essence, if you live in Manchester, New Hampshire, or you live in Ottawa, Ontario, or you live in Palisades, California, or you live in Kyiv, Ukraine, it doesn't matter. Where you live, based upon the hazards that you face from where you've chosen to live, and all of the inputs around you, what would a prepared person look like? By defining that clearly, we understand what we're trying to get people to do. Now, the level of preparedness in the population can only be determined by measuring it through surveys. First, you have to design what the heck you're measuring, which is defining the prepared person. Then you have to measure what's going on in society. Like, you've got a standard. How do people measure against that standard? Now you see where they may be shortfalls in that standard. You design a preparedness communications program designed to raising certain elements of that preparedness structure up. And then once your preparedness campaign is over, you go back and you remeasure to see who is listening, how many people adopted it, and what is the new current level of preparedness. And then you rinse and repeat this, and that process provides you a clear definition of what is the level of preparedness. When we define the level of preparedness, we can then say higher degrees of preparedness equate to better post-event outcomes, right? Which means the individual is ready to deal with the situation that's present where they live, which could be very significantly different from a town on the other side of the U.S., right? Salt Lake City and Moore, Oklahoma. Think about it. 2 different towns, 2 different sets of threats, 2 different definitions for prepared individual, right? Once you know what that is, getting that level of preparedness and increasing that level of preparedness is by default equated to better post-event outcomes. So that's the second one that we're worried about. The third variable that we look at is institutional trust. Now, we know that is falling since the pandemic, and I'm not going to get into good, bad, or indifferent decisions that were made during the pandemic, but institutional trust means the level of confidence the population has in their government institutions to meet their mandate and to tell them the truth, right? So if the population has a strong level of institutional trust, then they will first of all believe your information to be accurate. They'll believe that because you're the government, because we trust you, you've done your research and you're only telling us what is in fact helpful to us, right? So the content of the messaging is questioned far less. The second part of it is the adoption of the messaging. So the individuals will adopt it and make the necessary changes, which you will see in your preparedness level messaging measurement that we talked about previously. As well, though, this is a really interesting part. We know through research that people turn to trusted sources in times of an emergency. So when the big bad day comes, when the shizzy hits the fizzy, we know that people will turn to whom they trust. Social media influencers, church groups, community organizations. If the government has pre-positioned themselves as a source of trust in the community, then when a bad day comes, the community will automatically turn to the social feed or to the feed and the noise coming out of the government and pay attention, right? If you don't have high levels of social trust, if you don't have high levels of institutional trust, then your population frames the government emergency message with suspicion. Suspicion of what is their motive behind telling me this? What is the full story that they're likely not disclosing to me? That puts a question on now, is that information accurate? Or if I do what they tell me to do, am I just serving the outcome they want, even though it might not be helpful to me? Those conversations start to happen on social media. Those conversations start to determine whether people listen or not. So in other words, if you have low institutional trust within your target population, it frankly might not even matter what you put in your government alerts or your WEAs or anything along that, because the population just doesn't see you as a trusted source. So does it matter what you're telling them? Because if they don't trust you, then they're not going to see the information as carte blanche, truthful, and I should follow it. Okay. The last one, though, is a bit murkier and something we're just learning a lot more about. And that is the very trust in the government messaging that comes out, their views on it. Not the trust in the government itself, but their views on it, the style. Is it written in a fashion or methodology that is hooked? Does the population like it? Do they look at it? Do they consider it? And there's a whole bunch of things outside the trust question about the design, presentation, layout, choice of mediums, choice of influencers, choice of day, the language, the combination of pictures, etc. There's some great research coming out of the US that I think is brilliant and in Europe as well, on the tonality used in the wording, in the messaging. I think that's so important. It's not my area of specialty. I have mine. These researchers are brilliant and they have theirs. And so there's a lot of what we're really starting to understand is in the social media sense, and you will know this, you're probably nodding your head right now. You know the type of TikToks that make you stop scrolling. You know the type of Instagram reels that make you pause and watch the whole thing. There's a whole bunch of variables that go in there, but if you're my target market and I'm an emergency management communicator, I have to communicate with you in the ways that get you to stop and to look at my message, right? A prime example is a local fire department around here started a TikTok channel, and they had all the firefighters doing those funky dances that you see the young ladies doing out front of their fire trucks, right? But the message in the background was change the batteries on your smoke detectors. They were communicating that message by visually putting something that was entertaining and funny, and people remained on that TikTok for a period of time watching firefighters in their bunker gear try to dance like they were 14 again. But the message in the background is what people were taking away. Change the batteries in your smoke detectors. Brilliant. Somebody was learning how to communicate a very important preparedness messaging to the population by using the way in which the population wanted to consume information, not what you think was an appropriate methodology. And that's the point, right? we get back to the grounding of the entire argument of the podcast is we should be looking at evidence-based stuff on how to communicate with people versus belief and opinion, right? It doesn't matter what people believe, and it doesn't matter what people's opinion are. You see it all over YouTube. You see it everywhere. The point here is if the evidence shows that populations who did the following 4 things had better post-event outcomes in a myriad of situations from a myriad of different populations around the world, we start to build a consistent message that says, okay, here are those 4 things I need to do. My argument to you today in the article I wrote today and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of blog articles and books that I've produced over the last couple of years simply states that strong sense of community, strong sense of belonging, higher degrees of institutional trust, belief in the government's messaging, folding it the way it should be. It all leads to better post-event outcomes. And then understanding what the preparedness level is in the population, what it needs to be based upon the world they're in. Because remember, the United States of America has 40 million people. There are so many different hazards and everything around the United States of America. If you think you can design one preparedness message that is vague enough to be applicable to all 340 million people, you miss the boat. I argue with you, the only direct-to-consumer preparedness communication should be coming out of local governments, because even subnational governments, provincial and state, are too wide, too broad, and too shallow to be able to understand the totality of hazards faced. That's a personal belief. That's an opinion. I'm working on the data right now to see which ones are more effective, but I can't tell you one is more effective than another. That's a personal belief. Again, this is me telling you what I know to be true via the evidence, and this is me telling you what I believe to be true based upon what I think. Researchers are supposed to do that more often. Far more often than they do to say, hey, listen, I found a couple of peer-reviewed articles that agree with me. Well, I'll tell you this, and I'm a scientist, okay? If you have a crazy arse point of view, I can guarantee you can find a reasonable number of peer-reviewed, refereed articles that will at least correlate to what you think, right? 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 of these are produced every month in the social sciences and natural sciences. So I'm not worried about somebody being able to provide a whole bunch of wonderfully peer-reviewed articles that support their position. I'm looking at data evidence from actual events that have happened. And so if I'm going to come on this podcast inside my canoe head and talk to you, I think it should come from evidence. Hey, a quick break in the episode. We provide free preparedness and risk education across social media. If you're looking to up your game, learning to identify the risks that you and your family are exposed to, and develop a strategy to mitigate that risk, being prepared for whatever the world throws at you, drop by our website, www.preparednesslabs.ca. We've gathered the best knowledge from over 100 years of research into exactly what led to the best post-event outcomes and how people thrive in chaos. Now back to the show. So if evidence matters and the data tells us what evidence is, I'm happy with that. I prefer to go out and I have these 4 variables I'm talking about. It's our focus for the next year, probably the next couple of years, and running to see the more and more related to this. And then when you do a bunch of surveys, and we're going to do population surveys across the United States of America and some of the affected areas this year. We're going to do California, we're going to do Florida, we're going to do North Carolina, and we're going to do a population sample across America as a baseline. So we're going to put those together and publish them out because I want to understand the relationship between that. And the beauty of this is you're able to capture demographics. So I'm able to capture age category, education category, income category, and location category to see if any of that is influential. So older, more educated people, are they more prepared? Good question. These are the type of things that great data can answer for you, not what you think. Because I'll end on this one anomaly. It's not really an anomaly. It's something that most people think, but the data doesn't support. There is an argument out there that wealthier people or people with income are better prepared, and the preparedness requires an income. But none of the data supports that. The data does not indicate that a higher level of income equals better post-event outcomes. Now, you may shake your head and say, that's not possible. Well, the data doesn't show it. Actually, the number one socioeconomic level of community is a culturally specific community one step above welfare, which is the working poor. So people working at base level wages who are part of a strong cultural group, right? And you know what I mean. Go to the city park on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon and see which cultural community is out there with 70 or 80 people having a group picnic. That's the group that will have better post-event outcomes than the wealthy people in the rich neighborhood. The data says it. Again, it's not about what you believe. It's not about what I believe. It's not about the opinions that we wished existed that could support our narratives about the evil rich. The actual data doesn't agree. That's the beauty of being a researcher, and that's the beauty of using evidence to support what you assert. And when you don't have the evidence, to then say, this is my hypothesis, this is what I think, and I'm going to go out and figure out whether I'm right or not. That's pretty cool. So thanks again for joining us this week at Inside My Canoe Head. We appreciate all your feedback. Keep it coming into the website. Drop over to www.insidemycanoehead.ca. Everything you need is there. We ask you to share this episode with absolutely everybody you can. It helps out, obviously. We've got a YouTube channel where we put up a video that just talks about this and a little bit of a violent rant or whatever. We're getting better on this. We're having a lot of fun. But just remember this. We're here to provide you free of charge preparedness education based upon evidence that's not apocalyptic. We produce twice a week, roughly, except when I'm on vacation. We produce, or traveling for business, we produce 2 Substack articles, 2 podcast episodes, and 2 YouTube videos a week talking about various subjects. Those are all free. Yeah, we got paid products. Go over to preparednesslabs.ca. Some wonderful, incredible stuff over there. But our free information will always be free. It's our community service from us to you. And as a result, hopefully it helps you adopt a prepared life. Take care and stay safe.